Oh, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted. Try again. You're doing your lunch hour in your car? Your famous lunch hour in your car, or running from work in your car?
Running from work in my car.
Good man.
I got all my work done, so I shouldn't have any interruptions, which
Very
is nice.
nice. But if you don't hide in your car, suddenly they'll find more work for you to do. Yeah, I know how that goes. Like you're done, but if you're visible, they go, hey, actually, can you fetch me coffee? Can you fetch everyone coffee, actually? Yeah, it's funny how that works. So what you been thinking about, Mr. Luber? What you been working on?
Uh, I've been thinking about computation
Hmm.
and the difference between basically a symbolic computation and a semantic computation.
Oh, that's fascinating. So what do you mean by that, my friend?
So basically, symbolic computation to me is always pointing to something meaningful, where it is like what the symbol is actually addressing isn't the tangible thing, but is rather pointing to something that makes the tangible thing meaningful.
Hmm.
Where semantic computation seems to be, to me, the same thing.
Hmm.
It's also pointing to something that uh, is not necessarily isn't necessarily tangibly present, but is pointing to something that makes it meaningful, that which is present.
Hmm.
So I'm getting confused, honestly, on the difference between symbolic computation and semantic computation. I understand that when you hear semantics, it has to do with words, but when you break down words like A, B, C, that in itself are symbols.
Hmm.
Like they are symbols. So I'm listening to Stefan Wolfram a lot, and he's talking about his Wolfram language and how it has to do with this like narrow-minded, like in my mind, narrow-minded perspective of knowledge, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with something being able to be interpreted,
Hmm.
which is to me a separate domain. So it just seems like he's talking about a symbolic language that is what gives knowledge, but he says it in a way where it's like different than semantics. So I don't really understand what difference he's really drawing, or maybe I'm not understanding him. Maybe he's not drawing a difference, perhaps. But at least like listening to his like numerous podcasts, not podcasts, but conversations that are out on the web, it definitely seems like he's not talking about semantics, that he's talking about symbolic computation. So that's, I guess, the gist of what I'm thinking about. What do you think?
Well, that's pretty fascinating. And Dimitri, Javier, it's good to see you. And Javier, we're going to try to do the impossible because we can't do it, which is have a Zoom call using internet from the country. And if we do it, then that's going to overcome the melancholy of life and it will have great effect. I really liked what you were saying about how we have this sense that everything has to be exchange based. If we work really hard, we should get it. Is very interesting. Where does this kind of subconscious thinking that we're owed an exchange come from that you were talking about on YouTube? It is kind of interesting. It's almost like we confuse justice with a feeling of needing to have an exchange. Like if we do X, we're kind of ought to then get retirement later on, or if I give my love to you, then I ought to be loved back. I wonder if there's something about confusing justice with exchange. And if justice is not exchange, then what is exchange? And then maybe that philosophical melancholia that you were describing, I'll sometimes use that term to refer to the philosophical melancholia of David Hume, which I think is very important. Maybe that's part of like facing justice as not being exchanged and not being driven by a desire for a justice that is based on exchange, but a justice that maybe is just is, just being found in the disclosure of the case and being accepting of it, whatever it might be. I wanted to say the disclosure of being as itself. And maybe part of the reasons why we don't let disclosure being disclosed itself in a Heideggerian sense in Mr. Luber's honor is precisely because of our notion that justice would compel us to render being to ourselves on our terms because we worked so hard for it. Dang it, we wrote all these philosophical treatises. We're Western philosophy. We ought to get it being, dang it, on our terms. We are owed it. And there is a sense in which Heidegger comes along and he's like, no. Western philosophy, just because you did a lot of work, is not owed a disclosure of being. You have to clear that aside. but it feels kind of unjust to do that, right? It kind of feels unjust to clear aside your expectations. So I was thinking about your video on that. To your point, Mr. Luber, it is extremely interesting. The language of semantics, symbol, pointing away, it's interesting how we kind of conflate all of those together, but there may be nuanced distinctions between these things. In the same way that we all know there's a difference between noise and music, right? Like when you hear noise, you say, oh, that's not music. But what is the difference between a symbol, the way that a symbol points, like the bull in the Flannery O'Connor story, and say the way that a word points, right? Like it feels like when the word cat points to the phenomenon of cat, it's not really the same kind of pointing as a symbolic structure found in Greenleaf by Flannery O'Connor, right? Like there seems to be a difference going on. And I do wonder, like you're talking about how letters have a kind of symbolism to them, but the way that the letter A stands in for something does not seem to be the same way that the word cat stands in for something, right? And yet they both do a kind of standing in. What I always found interesting, as you know, like what I like to explore is precisely, Derrida was like, you can never cross the gap between the word cat and the phenomenon of cat, and then I'll pass it to Dimitri. What I find interesting is that's true, but there's this weird moment when you arrange the letters on the page and then you get the word cat, bam, the gap appears. So you do apprehend something and then the difference begins. So there is a certain apprehending something, but what you apprehend is immediately a gap between the signified and the signified, as opposed to for Derrida, it's kind of like, well, you never apprehend the thing because it's always deferring and deferring and deferring. But actually, there is an apprehending of the word cat that then in that apprehension suggests a gap. So I wonder if there's a difference between the way that the letters point beyond themselves and the way cat points beyond itself, because one of them points toward a gap, whereas it's almost like with the letter A, it points toward a sound. Well, this would get us into an interesting question. What does the letter A point to? It points to a sound, and yet the sound does feel like you reach the sound, right? If I go, ah, 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 it does feel like you reach the sound. But if I say cat, it feels like you don't reach the phenomenon of cat, right? But it's weird to think that ah is something you reach, but cat is not something you reach. And yet the letters like the letter A points beyond itself, but it points to something you might reach as a sound, whereas the word points beyond itself to something you may not reach if I'm thinking of a Derridian distinction. But it's quite interesting just to kind of open on, do we need to have a more nuanced understanding of things that point beyond themselves? Because categories like semantic, symbol, deference, all of these things are kind of blurred metaphysically, but there does seem to actually be some sort of differences between all of that. So that's a very interesting topic that you're exploring, Mr. Luber. And I appreciate you running out to your car in the middle of work to share your thoughts on that. I hope your boss doesn't see you and ask you to bring them coffee. If they do, just suddenly put the car in reverse and see where it goes. Don't look, have faith, do the impossible. Javier would be pleased. So Dimitri, good to see you, my friend. I hope you're well today.
Yeah, I was laughing because I actually have it planned with a tattoo artist to make a tattoo of an A, just like the letter A. So it was so funny that you said this. And by the way, Hegel actually mentions symbols in the Science of Logic. I was just reading about it. It's just before he goes into the judgment. So as I always do, I will read the Hegel passage here in the net. Also, anything else that might be supposed to serve as a symbol, like the symbols for the nature of God, can at best, so he's talking about symbols in general, can at best elicit only intimations and echoes of the concept. If, however, one insists on employing such symbols for expressing and cognizing the concept, then it is not their external nature which is fit for the task. The reverse relation applies, namely that what in the symbols is the echo of a higher determination is recognized to be such only by virtue of the concept, and it is only by shedding the sensuous standbys that we're supposed to express it that one comes closer to the concept. So in so many different religions, in general, I guess for Hegel, religion is that which represents the absolute, so it's definitely tied to how he conceives of symbol right here. But I immediately think of in Orthodox Christianity, they kiss these icons, right, when they come into the church. This is very famous in Orthodox Christianity. And for Hegel, it's actually like, that's like, this tie to the sensuous is in a sense less divine than the very concept. In the sense that for Hegel, philosophy, he says, is literally in the science of logic, is rational theology. So he literally says it's a service to God, and it's a conceptual service to God, whereby you need to shed yourself of, or distance yourself from this, from being caught up with the senses and representational thinking. This is for Hegel a problem. He actually explicitly critiques Immanuel Kant for not being able to do this. He says Kant actually couldn't relinquish his instincts to such an extent which is needed to think the absolute idea, basically. But yeah, here again, the problem with symbols is that a symbol represents a concept, but we can do conceptual thinking and express spirit by means of language already, conceptually. So in that sense, symbols are superfluous for a comprehension of what they are trying to get at. So let's say God, or whatever that may be. Now he goes on to talk about in this same page. He says something that I'm interested in right at this moment. He says, its higher and highest universal to which it rises is only a surface that becomes progressively more void of content. The singularity which it scorns is the depth in which the concept grasps itself and where it is posited as concept. So somewhere else in the science of logic, he says the essential moment of a concept is the contradiction, is when it contradicts itself. Of course, this is a basic lesson from Hegel. Now, what he is getting here at here really reminds me of the difference between the way academia, the difference that I see in my life. And I mean, I don't want to demonize all academic philosophy, but definitely there's a part of it which does abhor the depth of singularity. So maybe it was kind of vague to you all what Hegel's getting at here, but what I'm interested in is that he conceives of singularity as a descent. So whereas when you think of abstract universal notions, which we do all the time, there's a universality to that, whatever it may be. But actually, it would be void of content if we do not like embody it or imply it to our own singularity, which is scorned, something that is scorned for Hegel. Now here he also goes on to say that life, spirit, God, as well as the pure concept, are for this reason beyond the grasp of abstraction. That is, if you do not go into the descent of singularity. For abstraction keeps singularity away from its products, and singularity is the principle of individuality and personality. And so it comes to nothing but lifeless universalities, void of spirit, color, and content. It's quite interesting, actually, that Hegel would talk about, on the one hand, symbols on the same page, and then the descent into singularity. What exactly is the connection between that? That's probably something you can think about for a long time. But I think that there is definitely a risk in this identification with symbols without conceptual thinking, but that's quite self-evident. Well, not to everyone, but to me, I guess, anyhow. So
that was a beautiful reflection. Let me give it to Mr. Luber. I've been thinking a lot on that, and I'll just make a comment here and then give it to Mr. Luber on how it's very interesting, because I was talking to Michelle the other day. When we look at a tree, we kind of go, oh, that's not in my head, where numbers are in my head. But isn't when you look at a tree, it's in your head? right? There's some sort of bias where numbers are in your head, and for some reason that makes them almost more, for like a lot of people, that makes them more real because they're not in change, they're not in phenomenon. But when you experience a tree, it's in your head as well, right? And what I've been thinking about, it's almost like a concrete symbol, because we know the tree is not just a tree, right? It's made of the parts, and this is what Hegel's always talking about. And yet the tree is in your head. And in a sense, although some people associate numbers with more real than the tree, numbers are only in your head and not in the world. Whereas the tree, the phenomenon of tree, is both in the world and in your head at the same time. Which in a sense means it could arguably be more real. That makes it more real for Hegel. And yet then what that would suggest is you're dealing almost with something like a concrete symbol, because we know the tree is not a tree. It's the parts, it's the atoms, all the different things. And yet it also is the concept of tree at the same time, and that it's occupying in the head and yet also in the world, in a back and forth and a back and forth. And the moment you call the tree a symbol, that doesn't really work because it's not merely a symbol. But then when you say, oh, but the tree is a thing then, well, that also doesn't really work, because where do you locate the tree as opposed to the parts, right? But then, of course, here's the funny thing. If you say the tree is just its parts, well, you can't say the phrase that the tree is just its parts, because there's no tree to say it's just its parts. There's just parts being parts, but then the parts aren't parts, right? There's no whole there, right? So there's always this weird eating itself in the thought, and yet that very movement of thought is generative. Right, that very failure of thought in every time is generative, and it's almost like the way to get thought moving like that. I guess if I would have I guess I've been thinking about it like, it's like by realizing that the phenomenon of tree is in your head too. Just like we don't really think that. We think numbers are in your head. We think symbols are in your, like, concept, like ideas are in your head. But this bookcase I'm experiencing is in my head as well. It's just not just in my head, right? It's both. And then if you try to follow that thought, you end up doing this weird exploration of kind of a concrete symbol in a way. So there's this going down to meet the thing that then immediately thrusts you back in your mind, that then goes back in, goes down into the world, and then back into your mind, and you keep going and going. And that movement, which is a non-journey, is generative. Because you're just re-examining your immediacy, but you're returning to your immediacy, which is different from just accepting your immediacy, right? It's always weird because Hegel's like just getting you back to your immediacy. Well, couldn't we have just stayed there and saved us a lot of trouble? No, returning to your immediacy is very different than just staying with your immediacy. And so it's very interesting, like there's something like a concrete symbol or something, I'm not sure, but it's like a concrete symbol, which of course is a contradiction, and those would be Hegel's favorite. But let me give it to Mr. Luber, and then Javier Rivera, and then Dimitri. Mr. Luber.
First I want to say I'm shocked you were talking to Michelle about something. Shocked. But anyway, I have a question. I mean, with what Dimitri was saying, I just started reading Hegel, and I'm still not even past the introduction of phenomenology of spirit. I think it's just unbelievably hard. But anyway, when you say descent, I wonder what he means by that. Like, I have my own like thoughts on what he means by that, but I just wanted to hear, I guess, like your thoughts, the more Hegelian people's thoughts on what he means by descent. And then also when you bring up tree like you do, Daniel, and just like how we're talking about idea, it just, I forget which, all the Heidegger books become blurry to me, but it's like, I know it's later Heidegger, but he basically talks about an idea is basically, in Greek, it means face to face with the phenomena, that it's not something that's just buzzing around in your head, that you're face to face with it. And that I'm thinking that, with that said, the descent has to do with one's ability to be face to face with it. So yeah, I just I'm losing my thought, but basically, when Heidegger talks about thinking, he talks about it in a very seemingly paradoxical way, where he constantly says what's thought provoking is that we're not thinking, and that from that starting place is when you actually start thinking. Like, you're on your way to thinking is what he would say. So part of that on your way to thinking has to do with you coming face to face with the thought, with the phenomena. But the way he's talking about it is like the saying that is like, you don't have ideas, ideas have you. So the fact that the idea has you means that this descent, this thing beyond yourself, is putting you in a position for you to even be face to face with the phenomena. And that to me has to do with, back to what I was saying in the beginning, the symbolic computation of reality being that knowledge is always contingent off of that face to face, and that face to face is always contingent off of something that's beyond yourself. So that's that knowledge gap that people like keep talking about, which I find very like troubling that there's so much focus on that, because this gap seems to be something that you can't ever actually overcome. Like, so it makes me just question why people are obsessed with knowing in that like concrete certain way, when that gap is ever present. It's always there. And that to kind of talk like Stephen Wolfram a little bit, like the computational irreducibility of reality from the perspective of a finite being makes you think that the focus should never be knowledge, because knowledge is irreducible. Like, you can't actually reduce it to something certain. So it makes me think to focus on interpretation and how to actually have an interpretation in the first place, which is a completely different motivation than questioning why knowledge is there in the first place. And so my next question is that a fair thing to say? Is that a fair thing to talk, to basically parcel out knowledge is a different motivation that is kind of like a hopeless motivation? Like, it's like a hopeless romantic in a certain sense, while finding what actually causes an interpretation to be an interpretation in the first place seems to be something where I think knowledge would actually take place. That is where we could actually get knowledge, which is grounding the ability to even have an interpretation in the first place, which to me, I'm sorry if I'm not making sense. I'm
Can I
really
just
just
respond
thinking
to
out loud.
this?
Yeah, please cut me
Because
off.
I think you're completely on point, and I think what you said about Heidegger, especially, I immediately made me think about the introduction of the phenomenology of spirit, because this is the problem that Hegel wants to get at. He words it differently, obviously, than Heidegger, but it's true. Like, most thinking isn't actually thinking, or in other words, we could say like most thinking is picture thinking or representational thinking, whereas Hegel wants to do proper conceptual thinking. And this thinking especially in the introduction of the phenomenology of spirit, but also his philosophy as a whole, like science of logic, he's basically occupied with the same problem in a different form. That's what I'd argue. This is the problem of method. What is the method of thinking? And in the introduction, the way I read the phenomenology of spirit the first time, I just skipped over the preface and went straight to the introduction. And you kind of get thrown into this idea, and I mean, I would recommend you reading it a few more times, because then you can get a grasp of it, because it's kind of in the introduction, he's showing you what he's going to do for the entire book. But yeah, it's about the method of thinking. So whenever we encounter the failure of our knowledge, it's not only our knowledge that should change, but also truth itself that must change. And this is like a very radical step, because we can just say, okay, so all knowledge is a failure. But that's like a cop-out, because no, hold up, like, if you actually go into the failure and actually go into like the descent, or in some kind of maybe a state of disorientation or confusion where you encounter the limits of your own thinking, and if that breaks apart, you have to reconfigure what truth is, and that's super hard to do. But that's what actual thinking is, and this is why you get these different stages of consciousness up to absolute knowing, which is an affirmation of that gap that you were talking about, albeit also in a different form. Now, the difference that Daniel also talked about is that there's a certain immediacy of our I guess, of our subjectivity, of the way that we view the world. But we can mediate this by means of philosophy, and we return to the same immediacy, but it's still different. But it's also the same. But it's different though. But nothing's changed, but everything is different. So like this is kind of what you're getting towards. And in the science of logic, Hegel has three doctrines: the doctrine of being, the doctrine of essence, and the doctrine of the concept. Now, what he will get into in the doctrine of the concept is that what in the doctrine of being, in the sphere of being, we get the unity of being and nothing. So, for example, like it's very simple. Like being is nothing and nothing is pure being, because you cannot distinguish them, and therefore they are pure unity. But they are also absolutely different, because otherwise we couldn't make sense of anything, of course. So but it's about the movement that is taking place, and it's very easy. It's very easy to read over that. It's very easy to say you're really thinking along with it and like skipping over a thing, and then being like, hey, why does Hegel seem to be saying the opposite thing here? It's probably because it's hard to pay attention to all those subtle transitions that Hegel was making. But he calls the passage from being to nothing and nothing to being, and basically all the determinate concepts in the doctrine of being, he calls that transitions. Now, what actually happens in the doctrine of essence is a different type of movement. So it's not just that there's one movement, which is nothing is being and being is nothing, therefore A is B and B is A, and they're also the same. No, in the doctrine of reflection, you get something that comes up and then founders to the ground in a different form. I cannot really explain it here because I'm still struggling with it myself. Zizek will also talk about the differences in terms of geometrical forms, actually. So in the doctrine of being, you get the what is it called? Like let's say if you have a stripe and you twist it and you place it at the opposite end, you have one line. So this would be the movement of transition. The Mobius strip, that's the name. So in the doctrine of the concept, you get a different type of notional movement, which is then the Klein bottle. But I'm going way too quick here for your question.
No, that was good. That was great.
One more thing to say about the descent is that, so when I was reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, we had a conference about it eventually, and I did a project called Hegelian Tantra. And one of the Hegel quotes that inspired me to do that project is that Hegel says, spirit is only as big and as grand as it trusts itself to disperse itself. So it's basically like you gotta commit with your experiments, and you gotta you gotta follow through with the limits of your thinking, because the problem of an Immanuel Kant, for example, is that before encountering the limits of his thought and entering in that disorientation where he has to change knowledge and truth and reconfigure the method as a whole, is that he a priori makes a distinction between thought and its object of thought and brackets that off so he can occupy himself with other issues.
Loved everything you said right there, and I'll pass it to Javier Rivera. I was going to say to Mr. Luber, Michelle and I were talking, and there actually was an authentic bowl of ramen noodles at some point in that. So it was quite a talk. And Mr. Fishman, good to see you. I hope you have fought off those coyotes. They should leave your freaking chickens alone. I'll give it to Mr. Rivera here. I'm also wondering, to Rivera's recent videos, it's almost like we have this feeling that if I think really, really hard about a tree, I'm owed something. I'm owed the truth of that tree. There's like I'm really interested, like just listening to Javier, how much this kind of feeling that there's always an exchange going on actually permeates us in all areas, relationship and thinking. Whereas the entire idea of like, oh, if I think about the phenomenon, I should like be able to approach the truth of it. But really, the thinking about it is constituting the truth of it. So it's not an exchange, it is part of it already. Likewise, the relationship is like, I did this for you, therefore you're owed me this. It's like, no, the doing the thing for you is the making of the relationship. The relationship does not mean you are owed something. The relationship is constituted by that giving. Likewise, the thinking about a thing in a way is the constitution of that thing. You are not owed something by it, but there's so much of Western thinking that is getting to the thing in of itself, the truth of the thing, that has a kind of exchange language. And then our concepts of justice are constructed by exchange thought. It's interesting to think of the like this ultra permanence of exchange thinking everywhere. And then, and then I'll just note, and I'll give it to Javier. Yeah, I definitely think, Mr. Luber, that Heidegger and Hegel have an insane amount of overlap in different areas, just by different meta languages and so on and so forth. But Mr. Javier Rivera, good to see you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I'm really enjoying what you're talking about with justice. I've actually still been thinking about that when you brought it up. I think I'm gonna bring in Badu a little bit here because I think it's kind of helpful for me. Because I've been enjoying the way he kind of describes this. His notion of presentation and representation. So you know that whole question about the tree, like, does a tree exist if nobody's there to hear it fall or something like that, right? I think a way to answer this with Badu is that the presentation of the tree is not there, but we still have representation of tree. So it's representation without presentation, basically. And when you are there when the tree falls, you both have a presentation and a representation of said tree. So I really enjoy Badu kind of breaking it down like this, because it seems like his goal is that he breaks it down into like a trinity, where it's like there's normal, which is presentation and representation. There is both presentation and representation. But then there is singular, which he calls, I might be messing up the order, forgive me. It's presentation without representation. And then there's representation, which he calls excrescence, without presentation. And so what I'm understanding so far is that the goal is you're supposed to try to get representation and presentation. You're supposed to have inclusion and belonging. And this is how he kind of defines them, ties them together with inclusion and belonging. And so to tie that in with the exchangeist logic that kind of undergirds a lot of our thinking, I think the sentiment, if I'm being bold, I think the sentiment is belonging. But I think the sentiment, the interpretation of the sentiment gets interpreted as an exchange, right? That I want to belong. And so in this yearning to belong, I feel like something needs to happen. You know, an interaction and exchange needs to occur. I think the problem is that we take this byproduct of belonging as the actual logic for our thinking, the exchange itself. Because, and then going on your topic on justice, I really like you saying just is, because I mean, there's so many things about justice that is impossible in the sense that someone can be punished, but it's never going to be a punishment that alleviates the crime per se. You know, the biggest examples would be like somebody killing your family member and so on, like someone being sentenced to death or whatever, or even, being sentenced to death is probably the biggest one, right? Is justice served per se? when the person is still grieving and so on. I think in our moments of anger, it's like, yes, you get something in return, and so I feel some type of way about it. But I really do feel like it never really is justice served per se when you still have to grapple with the fact that the person's never coming back, right? Your family member's gone, they're never coming back. So there's no amount of justice that can ever make that return. So immediately you understand that justice at its most extreme levels, somebody, dying, can't provide you with an adequate exchange. It can't. And so this raises interesting questions about the logic of exchange, for what you're bringing up, Daniel. And yeah, I'm definitely curious to think more about it.
No, that was marvelously put, and I'll give it to Michelle here. It's very interesting because it's always like, it's not that exchange is bad, it's when exchange becomes the only logic. Like, we're always in this weird game, going back to an Augustine and Hegel, Hume, all this. It's like, it's never that it's bad, it's always the order, right? And it's always in relation with other ways of thinking, right? There's something about exchange that has some sort of natural propensity to dominate, to like be the overarching logic by which we think about reality. And that seems where you get into trouble. And maybe that's because exchange is inherently relational. And if everything is relation, then you're always in a mode about to exchange. And then since everyone is wounded and wounding and wounded and wounded and wounding, and everyone's doing their best and they're not appreciated, and people going to work and not getting the pay they should, and they work really hard on something that gets destroyed, that everyone is then in a mode to fight back. And the way you fight back is with a logic of exchange, where it'd be like, all right, life is treating me like crap, but I'm owed something better. And it's like a metaphysical comeback, right? Of getting that. It's like, well, I did all, and there's something where it's almost like, is exchange the metaphysical comeback to deal with the trauma of relations? And you can never escape relations. So you're always in that mode for that trauma. And then from that, exchange logic becomes the natural way to respond to being positioned in that trauma of relations, right? Rather it be you have to go to work, basically. You don't have to go to work, but you do, because you won't have electricity or the internet. And so there's all this like, well, the government owes me, or my boss owes, like, it's very interesting. Is there something where exchange is a response to the trauma of relations? And that's why it's so prevalent, because we're always in relation, right? We can't escape it. And so then exchange, that maybe that's one of the reasons it's such a dominant mode. And again, this doesn't mean exchange thinking is always bad. You don't want a society that has no doctrine of justice at all, no matter how imperfect it might be. And this gets us into the whole debate of Rawls, fairness versus justice, Thomas Sowell, cosmic justice versus legal justice, and all of these different categories we have to work through. But it's very clear there is something about the logic of exchange that naturally dominates. And maybe it's because we're always already in relations. And I'm very interested as well between that distinction on presentation and representation. If I were to think Hegel, presentation seems to be nature, representation is notion, and Hegel is all about nature notion, like coming to have a relation with reality where it's both. And that sounds Badiou, based on what you were saying with Badiou, where it's bothness. And then, of course, the move is everything is always already both presented and represented. And yet representation means it's not presented, and presented means it's not represented. And so there's always a negativity there that is unfolding in Hegel that is always already in everything that you experience. So there's a failure, but that failure is precisely the condition that makes possible experience and meaning. And so that's all kind of the weird move that's going on. But let me give it to Michelle.
But yeah, I wanted to just say something really quick. I've loved everything that's been shared. And I mean, this is just my silly like wordplay stuff, but I think that it's interesting. I probably brought this up to you, Javier, but like the idea of the word belonging, like I think that it's like, yes, you you be longing, you just be in your longing, like that's what it is. And so I think that helps to temper it being like constantly in exchange, because the word belonging can also get into possession, right? Like this belongs to me, like it's mine, you know. And so then that's when it's, I think, problematic, because it doesn't do it's not the kind of to use your terms, Daniel, from belonging again, but like the givens and releases, right? Where it's a holding and let go, holding, let go, holding, let go. Like we can't pretend we never hold or let go. Like it does happen, right? Like these things do happen, but it's the mindset of it's always mine that is problematic. And that's where it's like, it belongs to me versus I am being in my longing, right? That's how I belong. I belonging, which isn't grammatically correct, but that's fine. And then really quick on the word exchange. I think that it's funny because it's almost like a lot of times exchange happens because people want things to be different or like, and like you're saying, Daniel, like I'm owed, like, it's kind of this like comeback or sort of like, take that. Like I'm trying to get what I deserve or whatever, what I'm owed and stuff like that. And maybe it's like a kind of way to cope. And I think that probably comes a lot from like security though, because possession often is just to kind of like keep and remain. And that's the thing, like what happens is you end up just being like, there's something about this idea of like just being remains, right? Like as in like you're kind of dead in your just possession, right? Like you're just remains. You're not like you're just remaining there. And then with what really is interesting about exchange and that word is like it's kind of extricating itself from change. Like a lot of times people want to do exchanges and get something better. I should be having more in my life or whatever it is. And then, but it's like, that would require you to change. Like, it's not like that changes like that that might not ever change, but what can change, you can change. And so, oh, no, we don't like that. That's hard, and that's like, I don't know about that. So it's just interesting to me because I think exchange is very revealing. It's like we talk about money exchange, but we never really want to, we want things to change, but we don't want to change. And we don't really always pay attention to that like subtle distinction. So I think it's fascinating to talk about like my ex-girlfriend changed or my ex-boyfriend changed. Like, it's like my ex, yeah, my ex has changed, so I think that's really fascinating too. So I just want to add that, but yeah, thank you everyone.
No, that's brilliant. I'll give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. It's very funny because it's like in exchange, I don't have to exchange. It's my ex. Change is my ex. And there's a way too in which exchange is externalizing change. Like they have to change for me as opposed to I change. So it's very interesting where in exchange, you are you yourself changing. You're an ex from like an ex-girlfriend in the act of making them be the change, externalizing change to them as they ought to, because it's owed to you on the terms of that very exchange. I really like the wordplay there. Mr. Javier Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny about exchange is that you can subvert exchange itself via exchange. Meaning like you can change the conditions of exchange as an exchange. Like it doesn't have to be the dominating logic of exchange that we have today. And I started actually ironically thinking about like past history. Like back then among tribes, it was kind of like a rule, the notion of blood money, right? Like if somebody gets killed in your tribe, then you either ask for blood money or, you get to take somebody from theirs, basically. I'm not, I wonder if we ever overcame this logic. I mean, obviously we kind of conducted the justice system, the justice system, the justice system. and and I wonder if that just became just like a systematic blood money kind of logic. You do have to pay taxes. The government's going to be like, hey, man, if you don't give us this, we're going to take this. So, yeah, it is interesting that historically that there's some parallels. But what I noticed that's dangerous with the exchange thinking is that it immediately influences our understanding of power, right? And so it makes me already question what does power mean? What can power become if we don't have this exchanges logic? Because what I've noticed, in my own experience is that a lot of people depend on this kind of exchange because they don't want to be duped. They don't want to be taken advantage of. They don't want to be run over and stepped on and all these other worries. But for me, those worries are already predicated on a system of exchange. You can't lose if you don't abide by the logic of that exchange. You know, I'm sort of reminded of a friend that kind of confided in me that he didn't like, he broke up with his girlfriend and then she just wanted to be friends, and he felt that she was just taking advantage of him and by getting a better end of the deal as remaining friends, right? And I kind of told him, I said, honestly, I know it looks like a losing deal, but this is predicated on some type of exchange. If you rid the idea that you're losing something and that she's winning something, there's nothing to be had. All that exists is that friendship. That's it. There's nothing losing, gaining. It's only when you start thinking that you're losing something or gaining something that it gives us the illusion of asymmetry. But I think there is real asymmetry. I just think that exchange philosophy gives us an illusion of asymmetry. It's not real asymmetry. And so that also means that if we get an illusion of asymmetry, we also have an illusion of symmetry when exchange is quote, quote, adequate. I mean, this is my ironic take. The only thing that's symmetrical is the asymmetry, which is always relational. This is why I'm always against I'm always a little bit, I'm very critical about the notion of like boundaries. Like when people talk about like in relationships, you have to have boundaries. I agree with the statement, but it's kind of like one of those things that Daniel talks about where it's like, you know, everybody says love is good and all, but we need to think more about what we're saying when we talk about boundaries, because boundaries is not something that the identity makes, the self identity makes. It's a boundary that's relational. And most of the time people make boundaries for themselves. But what's so dangerous about that, in my opinion, is that how do you know that you are not, to use a contemporary term, gaslighting yourself by making this boundary? How do you know that you're not doing some avoidant maneuver with yourself by constructing this boundary and saying it's your boundary and protecting yourself, right? So if love already has a kind of danger to it, the only danger that the boundary is for the danger in the sense of maintaining the danger, maintaining the otherness of the other. And so we have to keep the boundary relational where it protects my otherness and it protects yours. Otherness and identity is different. I think that's the part that I always try to argue that's hard for people to understand. It's like the boundary is not there to protect your identity. It's to protect our otherness and the other's otherness. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, my boundary is that anyone except me can have chocolate cake. I just set a boundary where the chocolate cake is for me because I need chocolate cake in my Danielness, and you and everyone just has to appreciate that and not eat chocolate cake but me. And it's not my fault. I mean, I'm just someone who needs chocolate cake. And, you know, I was just made this way. It's just who I am. And so people have to respect that boundary. Because, you know, we're all dealt with the cards we're dealt, and I didn't choose these or different things. But let me give it to High Root. No, I definitely think boundaries for us versus for me is very, very different. And very often people set boundaries that unveil that they have a short temper or that they're not very, you know, they're very selfish, and they just call it a boundary so they don't have to work on that themselves. And then it becomes a kind of weapon, right? Where you're calling it a boundary, but really it's a legitimization of bad behavior, right? So I think the question is, when is boundary, it's language is always the problem, right? It's like the difference between definition versus signpost. Why don't we call it signs? Hey, I want you to know that, you know, I don't particularly find it relationally enhancing to watch TV together. I'm telling you that because you may think that I think our relationship is getting stronger when we watch TV together, but I don't feel that way. And I'm only telling you that not because I'm trying to set a boundary about how much TV we watch, but because you may not know that, but because from your hermeneutic and understanding the world, this is enhancing the relationship. And so it's more like what we're trying to say is translation of languages almost than boundaries. Like, I want you to understand my hermeneutic. But the problem with boundary is there's no work of understanding the hermeneutic. I just say, I don't like watching TV. I don't have to explain myself. There's no conceptual mediation. I just set a freaking boundary and you will honor it because I'm a victim of my personality or something. Like, that's the other thing. People talk about boundaries as if you're a victim of your personality. It's like, I have to set this boundary because I was born me. I just have a bad temper. So, you know, don't eat my chocolate cake. So it is very interesting. I think the question of exchange and power is very good. And I think it gets tied to the problem of scale. You definitely want the government to feel an obligation to build you roads if you give it tax money, right? Like if you gave it tax money and the government said, exchange isn't real, logic of exchange is bad, so they don't build you any like freaking roads, they would steal from you, right? And this also gets to the problem of belonging because of given, you know, the book will say that absolutely Deleuzianism, absolutely Hegel, like being someone who finds belonging and not having belonging is absolutely a solution to the problem. The issue is that sociologically, it is extraordinarily unlikely that the majority of people will find belonging and not belonging unless you can spread or scale the conditions of absolute knowing, which goes back to like net 30, net 28 or whatever. And so the sociological question of belonging and exchange or governmental exchange, political exchange is different from individual. But actually part of the problem is that we don't have different logics for different scales. We don't see each stack of the cake as bringing with it a different logic per se. So we overfit logics in different areas in different ways that change relative to the scale, which then gets the question of should there be scale? Should government be so big or should it be smaller? That gets you into that entire debate. But it is interesting how that question of scale and stack changes things in different things. But definitely boundaries for chocolate cake, because I am a victim of my love of chocolate cake. And if anyone eats it, my rage will come out. But it's not my fault. It's because they didn't respect my boundary at the refrigerator. So Mr. Highroot, it's good to see you. And then I'll give it to Mr. Luber.
Good to see you. First of all, victim of your own personality is a very like precise. I love that. It describes a few people I could think of very well. Okay. So we're talking about like the logic of exchange. It seems to me that logic is exchange, right? Like if A, then B, right? So it's like just the structure of logic itself is like, if you do A, you will get B in exchange, right? And so it's like justice, you're talking about justice, right? It seems like justice is when things happen according to the logic that we think they should happen according to, right? So it's like, you know, if somebody speeds all the time and then they get a ticket, we say, well, that's justice. Like, you know, if you speed, then you will get a ticket, right? And you can take it down to like the facts of nature, right? Like if you play with fire, you will get burned. And so when somebody plays with fire and they get burned, we say that's justice because it is like the reality of things lines up with our conception of the logic of exchange that things should be, right? And that's super important and powerful because like then we can act intelligently in the world, right? If we couldn't do that process, then like we would just keep getting burned over and over, right? You got to be able to explain to people, no, don't play with fire because you will get burned. But it's also dangerous because like you can never, it's like, what do you mean? Like there's plenty of people who have played with fire and didn't get burned, right? So like we can never fully reduce reality, the patterns of reality, to some kind of syllogism, some kind of like logical if A then B, right? We can sort of approximate them, but it's never perfect. And so if we rely on that too much, then we get trapped in this thing, right? But if we don't rely on it enough, then we're just kind of stumbling through the world. And so yeah, like so coming to the idea of like boundaries and relationships, like this is, again, it's super important that we do that, because what we're doing with that is like we're constructing the rules of our reality. You know what I mean? Like if you set a boundary and say like, I don't know, if you leave your socks on the ground, I will get mad, right? That becomes like a law of nature in your world. You know what I mean? It's like if you touch the fire, your finger's gonna get burned. If you leave your socks on the ground, I'm gonna get mad, right? And so it's like, it's powerful that we can do that. We can create the rules of our arena, you know what I mean? But like you guys are saying, you can also just like abuse that and just be like, well, I am king of the world and I set the rules. And so like, this is how it is, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's super interesting topic. I don't know if I have like a nice closer here, but yeah. It's super. Yeah, I'm interested to hear how you guys keep this going forward.
Well, everything you just said was magnificent. I'm going to give it to Mr. Luber. I think what you just said about boundaries being setting the terms of reality, if people thought about boundaries as that, they may actually be far better at setting them per se. The problem is people don't realize that basically if you set a boundary, it's basically setting the terms of justice in that relationship. But the problem is people set boundaries when they're in a bad mood, when they're like upset or arbitrary or without thinking about it. They just start calling something a boundary because you pissed them off, not realizing that setting the terms of reality from a place of irritation greatly reduces the probability that those boundaries will be useful for the flourishing of the relationship. So I think it's an extremely important point. I will also note and then give it to Mr. Luber. What you said about logic being fundamentally exchanged is hyper important, because if I were to say, again, the way to think about Hegel's logic, if I wanted to use the language we've used in this conversation that is extremely useful, Hegel wants to go through logic as exchange to get to the place where the exchange of logic is the changing of the terms of exchange, like Javier was saying earlier, which then works backwards and changes what logic is. But you have to go through the understanding of the one-sidedness, work through logic as exchange until you can get to the place where the exchange of logic is the changing of the terms of exchange. Just like Javier said, that's the motion of the concept, changing the movement of the concept, which then works back and makes all the work you just did with logic vanish, in a way, negated, because you just worked through logic to show that's not logic, and you just changed the terms that makes the logic vanish. But in doing that, a new logic can come forth, just like Heidegger's being can be in the clearing. And this is the logic of what I'll call AB, which is basically a way to think about it. It is where notion and nature, idea and reality, metaphysical and physical are two sides of the same coin. And therefore, the very thinking of logic changes the constructs of the reality in which you are using logic in, which then changes the basis of the logic, which changes the logic, which changes the basis of the logic, which changes the logic, just like you were saying. Like justice is relative to what is, right? Well, if you changed what is, you would change justice, right? So likewise, truth, the term in the conflict of mind is truth organizes values. Another way to think about it is what you believe is true changes what constitutes logic, right? What Hegel is suggesting is that logic arrives at the place where it realizes that the very act of considering logic changes what constitutes the truth, which changes what constitutes the logic, which changes what constitutes the truth over and over again, which then you would say, well, that sounds like relativistic chaos. And Heidegger says, no, it's not, because the tree in front of you is actually there. The material world is actually there. And that's why the logic has to descend, fall back onto the concrete reality. That's where being transitions into essence. It is now descended into actuality. And in that, reality then becomes concept as a mixing of the physical with the idea, metaphysical, meta in parentheses. And this is why the concrete reality at the end of the day is like basically central for Heidegger, because the concrete reality is what keeps the self-creating movement of logic from flying off into chaos. And in fact, in being in a relationship with physicality, can creatively unlock what is possible in physicality while simultaneously still being concrete, because in every movement of the logic, every moment of the movement of the logic, it is concrete in that moment of that movement. And then as it changes, then a new concrete basis arises, then a new concrete basis. And this is how you can suddenly have a mixture between change and objectivity per se, like the ability to change and yet still have a concrete truth. You can have a transformation, but not have it be radical relativism, because you are in that dialectical dance. So everything you said is just spot on. And I think the language of exchange, logic, Hegel's logic, changing the terms of exchange, which changes the terms of the logic that arrived at that point, negating it all. And then logic is unveiled as being in a dance with actuality to change its very constitution, which then, of course, if the tree in front of you is in your head, as we were saying at the very beginning to some degree, and all of this is occurring in your head, then the very construct of the tree in front of you in the park is participating in that alive way of being. The very physicality of the tree is intelligible, because if the tree is intelligible, then it must have some sort of similarity with the very way that you think. And so then Hegel, and I think Heidegger actually as well, is suggesting that the universe itself has in its very construct a similar feedback loop with itself in relation with the notion that makes it intelligible, thus inherently meaningful, thus alive. And then materiality is not a dead thing, it is a live thing in a dance with the human subjectivity, which is isomorphic with that very nature. So I think the point that you were getting at is very big, and it kind of points to it points to basically how Hegel wants to go into logic and unveil the universe is not what we think it is. But let me pass it to Mr. Luber.
That was great. What to me that's storytelling. Like that that's what I get very confused on why people don't see that as storytelling, because literally the change from the concrete to the abstract and wrestling with what allows you to even have that relation is literally what like screenwriters do. Like that is just like what they do in like the most concrete way in my mind. I haven't written a philosophy book, so maybe that is also what philosophers do. I think that's what philosophy does. Yeah, exactly. I think it, everything I hear about Hegel just really reminds me of Heidegger. It's quite remarkable. Heidegger to me would just say that that process that you're talking about is in an effort to complete the wholeness of basically being face to face with the tree. And that doesn't necessarily mean he uses I remember he uses the word it's not patching up a completion. It's not completing something. And that goes back to this whole computational irreducibility, and that we're finite in this infinite universe, and that we're just constantly going through this forest, completing the wholeness of what we think is whole based off of being finite, but always discovering that there is always a new journey that always finds a new, not patching, but a new completion, if you will. And you just continually go on to a new completion because we are situated in an infinite amount of information, and that we can only contain a finite amount of information. So yeah, I just think that was what you were saying is beautiful, and I feel like that is my interpretation / a little bit of Heidegger's. I just kind of wanted to address what I was wanting to say with Dimitri earlier, with my comment. I really like the exchange. It just really makes me think of this primordial dimension of when the idea is gifted to you. So when the phenomena reveals itself to you, how that reveal occurs is in a pre-language dimension, and that we have to change from being in that pre-language dimension, and we have to change ourselves in a fashion where we have to package this sensation into a language to then communicate to another person who also is starting from a pre-language realm, and have to basically come up with some story to communicate being in a dimension that is pre-language, being in a state that is basically pre-language. That is the state of the revealing state. And what's very interesting is, and this is what I've been kind of obsessed with for the past year or so, which is that pre-language dimension. That is where, in my mind, the real science needs to take place. And that science only takes place within this packaging of language, the story dimension. And that pre-language dimension is the thematic dimension. And Heidegger says, what withdraws is what draws us in. And that withdrawing from the phenomena that reveals itself, how we draw into it, that is the story. But that initial withdrawal is that pre-language dimension. And I'm just questioning constantly, how is that withdrawal able to express itself? It seems it's contradictory. It seems like it can't actually express itself, because the second it is able to express itself, that is when the packaged language is occurring. That is when the story, we are in the story dimension and not the thematic dimension. So I'm just curious on if it's possible to have a, I don't want to say language, I don't know what it would be, but some type of processing of the pre-language dimension. But even me saying the processing seems to be contradictory. Like, the act of processing would literally be within the story domain. So I'm like struggling to communicate what exactly this like domain is, besides calling it theme, quite frankly. And the only other access that I find really fruitful for me, I mean, I'm sure there's other access points, which is sex. When you talk about the sexual, when you, what is sex? What's her name? Supanchij. But again, that isn't from a language standpoint. That is from we are inherently sexual beings, and that the actual like repression of that sexualness is how we understand sex. But yet it's not sex itself, because the repression, it's that double move that's occurring within that conversation. I'm struggling to express this dimension without having this double move. So it makes me think, do you need to have this double move? But I have this feeling that you don't need this double move, because when the phenomena reveals itself to you, you are just in it. You like, there is not a doubleness occurring. There is just a pure reveal. And like, the only way like to understand it is through that withdrawal from that initial reveal. And that's when the double movement occurs. I hope I'm making sense. I'm really thinking out loud.
Yes, it's excellent. I'm going to pass it to Javier and highlight a few things. First off, so you have never having language, then you have language, and then you have giving up language, but you have to have language to give it up. For Hegel, yes, Heidegger and Hegel are remarkably similar. What Hegel talks about is history, but for him, history is a story. I mean, you can go for the cheesy theological point that history is his story of God. And so when Hegel is talking about story, when he talks about history, it is a story, but the story is the highest principle of reality, actually follows the logic of story. And in fact, frankly, the phenomena, as you know, I am a strong believer that the phenomenology of the artist is the secret, not the secret, but kind of the secret to thinking philosophy and the way we need to think about it. Because what has happened earlier was said, you know, that we haven't started thinking. One of the reasons we haven't started thinking is because we've learned what thinking is from school, and school makes thinking research, not painting, not storytelling, not art. So we all, from school, learn that thinking is research, which is exchange. I worked really hard to do the experiment, so I am owed a result, exchange logic, when really we have to think of thinking as, what do you do in making a story? What is the nature of the thinking in writing a story or exploring an idea? Like when Javier is doing a live YouTube video, is he researching when he does the live YouTube video? Kind of, but no. It's alive. It's unveiling itself actively as you're going. And then when it unveils itself actively, just like Heidegger's being, it is not random. It feels very concrete. It's like, yes, that's an A thing. Here's the other key point. Everything I said in my before could sound like reality is chaotic, right? Like it's all relativism, thought is creating and different things like that. The moment where reality discloses itself, just like Heidegger talks about, which I would associate with the moment of beauty, which is when your faculties are suspended and something greater than you unveils itself, is a moment that verifies that reality is there. There is a there, right? And then you go back to your daily life. Maybe you have 20 of these experiences in your entire life. But every one of those experiences means that reality is there. And then when you are engaging in this onto-epistemology of Hegel, where you are creating actively what's there, it's because the there is letting you. The thing that is objectively there, that you have a reason to believe because of experiences of the closure and being coming forth, which means there's something there that is not reducible to you, is precisely creating the space where you are allowed to creatively dance with it in the Hegelian sense of logic that I was just describing earlier before. So again, here's how we have the balance. In a way, it means that reality is a concrete thing that lets you create out of it. So it's not all relative, because there's a concrete thing that you can have experiences disclosing themselves to you, but then you are creating out of it. It is mimicked, it is isomorphic to a conversation. You're talking in a conversation, and then suddenly you go, oh, that's a good point. Oh, that's not reducible to us just talking. That actually fits somehow with reality, and then you create with it, you play with it. Then you start like looking around with it, right? And you're like, okay, and maybe some of the stuff you say fits, other things don't fit, but a thing comes forth that feels more concrete than the other things you say. And the moment it comes forth, though, then you're able to play with it until you find another thing that feels concrete, building upon the last, building upon the last. That very structure that emerges in conversation is precisely the nature of reality. Like, that is what Hegel is putting forth. That is what logic is doing. Logic, in a way, is trying to have a conversation with reality, and reality can talk back because it's actually there, as we know from experiences of disclosure of being or when being comes forth, right? There is a thing there that is conversing with you, communing with you, that lets you creatively play with it, but not because there's nothing there, but because it's very nice. It's very kind. It makes space for you to create with it. It's creating that different space. I'll give it to Javier, but the logic of the story is very important. And basically everything you said for Hegel is what logic needs to see itself in the business of. Logic, for Hegel, you have to start in understanding. You have to start in a logic of exchange, but then you work through the logic of exchange. You work through language precisely to get to the place so you can experience your inability to speak the pre-linguistical reality that you can only meaningfully know is there in the act of language failing to speak it. So you have to go through language for the pre-linguistical to be meaningful to you as an unveiling that language was never doing what you thought it was. Likewise, logic has to come to the place where it changes the conditions of the logic to realize that logic was never what you thought it was. But in Hegel, you do, to your question of do you have to go through the linguistical per se to get to the pre-linguistical? Do you have to go through the understanding to get to the place of the clearing? Yes. This kind of mimics a certain fall structure where man is fall and man is infinitude. Man has to start in one-sidedness to get to the place to realize no-sidedness per se. But you have to go through that, because if you encountered the pre-linguistical without language, it would be meaningless to you. You made the example of sex. There's an example of sex without language. Then there's a form of sex where you're talking too much, so you're out of the sex. But then there's a form of sex that is better because you spoke and let the words go and become the action of the sex itself. Right? Like, there is the speaking of the creative act that gets you to a place where you stop talking, but the silence that comes after talking is actually more meaningful because you spoke yourself to that place, and thus it is enhanced. And that's kind of the move. A logic that fails is better than no logic. That's the Hegel move. Language that gets to the place where it realizes it cannot say what needs to be said is better than never speaking. It is better to have a language that fails than to always have silence. It is better to clear and have being disclose itself than never clear anything and being be there. But since you never cleared anything, you do not meet the conditions for that being to be meaningful to you. So it is better for being to come forth in a clearing than being just to be. In the same way that it is better for intercourse to leave behind an intercourse so that it is actually more meaningful. And so the creative act is better precisely after the struggle to be creative than simply the painting without that struggle. The struggle generates life. The effort to try to achieve what you want through exchange that leads you to the place of realizing that the logic of exchange is empty is better than never trying to exchange. The failure is life. And I think that is definitely part of Hegel, but that can only really be understood also in the life of an artist. Because the life of an artist, that's why the phenomenology of the artist is so important, is a perpetual process of trying to create failing, creating out of that failure, where for Hegel, we think of success and failure, we're one-sided, we separate them. Hegel says you go through the one-sidedness of trying to be successful without failure, precisely so you get to the place of failure, which is your opportunity to realize that failure is the other side of success. Now they are merged in reason from understanding, and now it is possible for you truly to create. You attempt logic as a process of exchange to get to truth, precisely to find out that logic cannot get to truth that way, which makes you realize that, wait, the process of logic and the realization of truth are two sides of the same coin, works back, changes the nature of the reality the entire time. The failure is the changing of the beginning. It loops around like the Mobius strip that Dimitri was saying. It is the end of one circle, arriving back at the beginning and making it new for the very first time. Let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera and then Mr. Hairu.
I'm going to try to do kind of some different maneuvers here where I might be saying the same thing as Daniel's saying, but a different way. One thing that comes to mind is what Badiou brings up with this, the law of one and the count of one. I think what's kind of interesting with this logic that Badiou's putting out, and I'll give an example of what I mean, is that typically with exchange logic, we think it's one for one. But what Badiou is saying is that we tend to take a bunch of these multiplicities together and then say, that's one, that's a wholeness, that's a whole thing. So I think it's interesting at least in the context of the conversation of like the logic of exchange, because you can see immediately that the exchange is never one for one. According to Badiou, it would be a multiplicity of a multiplicity of a multiplicity of a multiplicity of a multiplicity. The failure that Badiou is going to point out is that you're counting it as one. And so if you think that whatever exchange you're having with a person is equal per se, you are doing a count as one. And this is what Badiou basically calls as cause and effect. But cause and effect, the effect is always predicated on the cause, but the cause is also an effect, and so on. So you basically call it one. And it's a retroactive kind of naming of one. It's always retroactive. This is what Badiou is going to argue. It's always a retroactive naming of it being one. So he's always going to say it's a multiplicity of a multiplicity of a multiplicity. And this gets really interesting with exchange because it means that in the realm of exchange, all you ever encounter, at least according to Badiou, is just another multiplicity and another multiplicity. So that means that the exchange can never be satisfied, but you still need to have an exchange, right? So, you know, it does reveal to me like there is a danger in the fact of thinking that exchange is one for one when it's never really one for one. It's always a kind of multiplicity of a multiplicity. It's possible that you label it as one, but you never capture the entirety of the multiplicity, and this is the failure in the idea of the exchange, which is really fascinating to think about, because Badiou actually already challenges the notion of parts and wholeness. He's challenging this idea actually, which I find extremely fascinating, where the wholeness really is just this logic that we've come up with to just label it as one. But Badiou is trying to argue how inadequate that is. And this also kind of leads into the idea of why we ended up having an ontotheology and everything like that. This concept of oneness, which is, again, really interesting to think through. But there's something else that was said. The ontology of choice I wanted to bring up, actually, because I feel like Andrew kind of got there, and then Daniel hit it on the mark too. It's this idea that choice, like I like describing choice as almost like void-like. It's so void-like. You make a choice, and then you have to make another choice, and another choice, and another, and it just keeps multiplying. It literally keeps multiplying to where at a certain point, you're not even sure at what point this was conditioned or you conditioned it. right? Like you don't know if you conditioned this or it was already conditioned. And that's the sort of subtractive notion or ontology for choice, in my opinion, where it just continues to multiply, and you get so deep in your own, I guess, like filth that you don't even know, like you're being conditioned by your own conditioning, but you don't even think it's your own conditioning. So you think it's the actual reality of things. And this is kind of like what Daniel was talking about, where it's like the further you go into it, you realize, oh, wait, actually, you could just change that notion, which retroactively dissipates that whole entire concept, basically. And then we discover reality, but we still have to kind of go through that that whole process. And it's funny that, you know, when Andrew brings up, you know, storytelling, I feel like storytelling is like choice, but choice in duration. Like it's a multiplicity of choices in time. And I know it varies a little bit different from the way you philosophically break it down, Andrew, but I'm just going with the just contemporary notion of just storytelling. You know, it's basically it starts with a choice and then it just continues to multiply ceaselessly, right? And it's a duration in time. And it's so funny because when you enjoy a good story, you get so immersed that you start beginning the initial choices that started the whole story. Right? It probably might not be until the end that you understand why the beginning was relevant. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Let me give it to Javier, but right there is a great example because you make a good choice is one that like helped you reach a place where you kind of forgot you made a choice because you're so immersed in the story. There's a kind of negation that occurs there, right? And it's also very interesting because the choice to enter a story, when you have a great story, a movie starts playing in your head and you're looking at like words on a page, but you're not looking at words on the page as you look at words on the page. Like because of a choice, you enter into this very strange phenomenological place that makes you forget the role of choice. And yet every moment of that phenomenological experience is thanks to a choice. And these are the extraordinary, intellectually pregnant experiences that when philosophy taps on, you start finding a lot of things. And the last point I'll make quickly, the point you just said, like for Badiou, one, everything you said about multiplicity, one, for Hegel, you have to think the one to realize there is no one, just a multiplicity. So that changes the nature of everything you were doing when you started. Well, that's weird because how did you start then? Like, how did you start if you reach an end that unveils that what you started doing wasn't what you were doing? That is the move that characterizes Hegel's logic. Another way to put this, you made the point of saying that wholes and parts are not wholes and parts, right? That means you just said the only reason that sentence made any sense is because I know what whole and parts are, but you use that sentence to say that the word whole and the word part do not mean what they think they mean, right? So what did you do with that sentence? You said, I know this sentence is one you will understand because we're all wrong about these terms, but I have to speak that wrongness to move the understanding to a place of dialectical reason to realize that the word whole doesn't mean what we think it means, and the word part does not mean what it thinks it means, right? Because whole and parts are always in concert. Well, if they're always in concert, then wholes are not wholes and parts are not part. There's something else that's going on, more like a symphony orchestra or an emergence. Like right now, everyone's talking emergence, right? The only reason the word emergence makes any sense to anyone here is because of a history of getting it wrong. You had to have a history of misunderstanding the nature of reality where you thought about it in terms of wholes and parts to gather the concepts needed. So when you arrive at this moment in history, when you talk about emergence, the concept of emergence is meaningful. So mistake is necessary for advancement. But in the very advancement of emergence, that unveils the entire logic you operated through history was wrong. But that wrongness was necessary to make the emergence meaningful to you now. In the same way that you have to, the question was asked, do you have to go through language to get to the pre-linguistical? Yes, you have to go through error to get to the place where the thing is meaningful, that then makes it seem like you didn't need to go through the error because it was an error. you know, today, realizing emergence makes it seem like it was stupid to spend history thinking in terms of wholes and parts, because the very realization of emergence makes that seem wrong. But the only reason you can make sense of the logic of emergence is because of that mistake in history that you then negate. That is then sublated. You know, that's why he's using the term sublation, because emergence is a sublation of whole and parts. It contains the old in the new, but in a manner that makes it seem as if the old was never needed. And yet the only reason that sublation occurs is because the old was there to seem like it was never needed. Likewise, you use language to reach a place where you can throw language aside, but you need language to have something that throws aside. And the act of throwing it aside is what creates meaning. This is what we don't understand. It's precisely the sacrifice per se, the throwing aside, that then has a meaning come forth that is not merely an arbitrary like, but something that feels like it's disclosing itself. Because here's the move. If you throw something aside and something comes forth, then what comes forth does not feel reducible to you. Because you didn't make the thing come forth. You were throwing something aside, right? If I have this in front of my face and I move it aside, the laptop suddenly feels like it's outside of the notepad, right? Because what did I do? I was moving the notepad and then the friggin' laptop appeared, right? So likewise, if we are negating with our logic and being discloses itself, if I'm negating whole and parts and a new understanding of reality comes forth, captured in the language of emergence, that would give you reason to think the emergence is not merely subjective and relative. Because it emerged, it came forth while you were subjectively moving aside. Therefore, there is reason to think that it's not a product of subjectivity, because your subjectivity was moving something aside while this thing came forth. So this thing that's coming forth is not your subjectivity, or there would be strong reason to think that, or that the character of subjectivity is very, very different. But let me give it to Mr. Highroot, then Mr. Luber, and then Javier Rivera as we come up on the end. I fear I will have to go unfold a whole lot of chairs and different things. But let me put Mr. Highroot, please.
Yeah, so this whole conversation is really interesting. And yeah, the whole relationship between the whole and the part is, like you're saying, it's this like kind of paradoxical thing. Because to say like there is no hand, only a multiplicity of fingers, it's like the only way you can say the finger is part of the hand is to recognize that it's one finger. You know what I mean? So like each part has to be one in order to be a part, right? To be a part, one part of the whole. And so it's like this, like Javier was saying, like you might not realize why the beginning is relevant until the end, and yet you have to perceive the beginning. This is John Vervaeke's whole thing about relevance realization, right? Is that like you have to choose what is relevant to you, or not really choose, but like, you know, there's something going on that selects what is relevant to you based on the end that you could put it to. But in order to figure out what end you could put it to, you have to first see it, right? And so like this whole thing about the pre-linguistic and the linguistic, it reminds me again of something that John Vervaeke has said, which is that like he talks about how they've done these experiments where they'll give people psychedelics, and they'll ask them about their experience, and they'll describe phenomenologically the same thing, right? They'll say, I experienced these feelings of euphoria and this sort of like, you know, colors, and they'll describe the same phenomenological, direct, immediate experience. But then they'll say, like, what conclusions did you draw from this? And they'll give completely divergent answers, right? One person will say, I was having this experience, and then I realized that God is real, and he's been watching over me the whole time, right? And somebody else will have the same phenomenological experience, and they'll say, and that's when I realized there is no God, and I don't need to worry about his judgment, right? And so it's like, what do we do about that? You know what I mean? And to Andrew's point, it's like you're saying the science needs to be at the sort of direct, immediate, at the level of the direct, immediate experience. But as soon as you say anything scientific about it, as soon as you say I had an experience of blank, you are negating the direct immediacy of the experience, right? And so it's like, in order to communicate your experience and share it with somebody else, you have to put it into the linguistic register. But as soon as you do that, you negate it, right? And so I guess the move that you're talking about, Daniel, is that then you use that linguistic framework to bring people into your experience, which then moves beyond the linguistic framework, right? And this reminds me of a conversation that I was listening to between Tim Adelin and Cadell Lass, and they were talking about the move from spirituality to religion, particularly within a Hegelian context. And what they were saying, I hope I'm not misunderstanding, but I think what they're saying is that like spirituality has to do with this direct, immediate phenomenological experience, right? And then religion has to do with the symbolically mediated relationship. You know what I mean? And so it's like you have to go into the linguistic register in order to bring coherence and to like communicate with people, right? Because otherwise you just have your own direct, immediate revelation, and it's just you and your revelation, and that's it, right? And so in order to create some kind of world that you can bring other people into, you have to go up into the religious linguistic register. But then you want to eventually, like I would say the purpose of religion is to bind that sort of immediate direct experience of whatever, right? Like whatever the religion says that experience is of, into the mundane, so that it's not ultimately separate, right? And so that would be going beyond it. I don't know. That's just what I've been thinking as I've been listening to you guys. Really interesting conversation.
That's excellent. Another way to think of what Hegel is doing is you just made an extremely good point that if the scientific investigation is reaching the immediacy, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber before you run. Mr. Luber, no, don't run.
I was just going to say basically my comment with a bunch of other words, but the gist is you're good. You're good. You're good. You're good. I do gotta run. I love you guys.
We love you.
Have a good day.
Thank you for risking your employment. We appreciate it. We appreciate it.
No problem.
We appreciate it. But thank you, Mr. Luber. It's always good to see you. Best to you, sir. And I will have to run in a little bit myself, but Mr. Fishman said something very important. There's this idea that the scientific investigation, the moment you say experience of, you negate the immediacy. So this is what Hegel wants to say. In the same way that the moment you talk about spirituality, you need a symbolic mediation or it's meaningless, right? Or maybe you're just an isolated person in the wilderness or something. What Hegel wants to say is for most of human history, we have considered logic as the process that leads you to that quandary, okay? Like logic is the investigation that makes you negate the immediacy. Hegel says, what if we started logic on the point of the negation? Like, what if logic begins precisely on the reality that trying to think of immediacy loses the immediacy? Like, to base the logic on the point where that negation happens, as opposed to making logic the processing that causes the loss of immediacy. That slight little switch that sounds really weird is what Hegel is saying we haven't thought. All we have done is created logics that negate immediacy, as opposed to logic based on the reality that logic must negate immediacy. There's like a meta move there. What does logic look like if it tries to be logical about the fact that logic always negates the immediate? Like what kind of logic forms then? Oh, well, suddenly you have a logic that's always working back on itself, negating itself, checking itself, trying to like logic about the whole, but then realizing the whole isn't made of its parts. So what the heck are we even doing? Coming back to the immediate phenomenological experience and saying, oh, well, I only experience this as a tree because I'm a human and not a squirrel. You know, I have a certain conditioning that changes things. So logic, when it makes central that inability of it not to negate immediacy, has an incredibly different character. And that's what Hegel is saying. Now, I think a lot of people today are in that camp who understand that problem. You know, you mentioned Vervaeke, absolutely. But at Hegel's time, like no one was. And then maybe just recently, we've started thinking about this problem of thought automatically cuts you off from. Now, this is why Hegel's critical of Kant, because Kant says, yeah, that's what thought does. And Hegel's like, no, that, you know, he sees like the end of philosophy in Kant, because Kant basically says logic is indeed the processing of immediacy and we can never access immediacy. Great. And Hegel's like, no, that's the beginning of logic. And if it's not, philosophy's dead, because then of course all there is science. All there is the effort to get as close to the immediacy as you possibly can through a contained laboratory setting that you will have reason to think is more so the case in its immediacy than not, because of falsification with a Karl Popper, and that's all thought can be anymore. like a process of falsification. That's it. And of course, that's really important. Hegel is definitely pro-science, but he also realizes that if that is the only thinking that you have, then yeah, you're going to have reductionism. For him, it's the death of spirit. He straight up says, like, you're going to have a meaning crisis. He doesn't use that language, but that's basically what he says. He's like, nihilism is what follows. And that is what followed. But then he also realized that to avoid that, you have to think, you have to base a logic on that problem of always negating immediacy and thinking from that. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Javier Rivera.
Oh man, there's a lot there. Actually, you bring that up, falsification. That actually seems to correspond with the logic of exchange. Actually, that the logic of exchange is a way that we falsify, a way we sort of prove some type of the relation itself, right? That we want some type of way to continue on with the relation through this falsification. What's interesting, as a side note, because you talked, I brought up Badiou, and then you responded, Daniel, is like one of my I'm still struggling with my gripes with Badiou, is that he's making this case for, no God, right? Just a multiplicity of infinities, essentially. And it's just funny because it's like he says this. He says, my philosophy is basically so parallel to theology, but it has a slight deviation where I just say no God, right? Like it's just like, and Badiou is doing this weird move where he's saying, yes, there's an infinity, but like his gripe is that if you predicate life on finitude, then you come up with a God. But so if we start with infinity, then we can negate God, basically. And at least this is my understanding so far. And I don't have a gripe with it. But what's funny about this, and this is where like my ontology of choice comes in, I'm like, cool. So if reality is the void, Badiou, then I can just say God is the void, right? And he'd be like, no, that's not the proper name. The proper name is the void, right? You can't say God because God means it's under the one and so on. And I'm like, no, I could just change that definition. God is multiplicity. God is infinite multiplicity, right? I can just do that. That's what's so crazy about reality, is like I can just do that, because I feel like there is nothing about the word God that I can't just begin to redefine and retranslate and rethink, basically, right? Like all Badiou shows me, like you kind of pointed out, Daniel, is that the history of God, the way that we have it so far, fails for Badiou, right? I'm like, okay, but that means that, does that mean that God is done with? It just means like a reworking of that concept. It just means that there's a danger, at least this is the helpful side of Badiou, there's a danger to asserting God is one as such in the context that Badiou frames it. Right? In the context that he frames it. There is a danger. I do believe in that. Martin Buber actually has very similar, ironically, very similar justifications the same way Badiou does. He's almost implying that, well, if you say one, you can't say one without implying another one. So in order for you to say one, and this is Martin Buber's argument against Hegel too, it's like you can't say it's one without, how do you know it's one if there's not another? And so like Buber actually ironically has a kind of like God as multiplicity kind of concept, but it's a relational multiplicity. Like God can only emerge through a genuine relation of another. So it is kind of like it is kind of Badiou-like in a way, and I do agree. I recently encountered Badiou's critique of Hegel in Being and Event, and that was very interesting. he disagrees with negativity, negation as internalized. He's like, tell me, I'm very curious. I'm so sorry that I'm going over the board here, Daniel, and I know you got to go, but like I just got to add this question. Maybe we can talk about it more offline. But you talks about how he breaks down bad infinity and good infinity, and I just want to relay that I understand this correctly because I know you've finished reading Hegel. But the way that I understood it, the way Badiou understands it, is that bad infinity is this idea that a finite thing leads to another finite thing, finite thing, finite thing, finite thing, infinity, but that's just bad infinity. The good infinity is actually a result of the bad infinity, which is the quality of the repetition itself. That's the good infinity, if I'm understanding that correctly. But Badiou then says that he's like, I don't know why Hegel just decides to just throw the name infinity at this, where he believes that quantity and quality infinities are both separate, and that he's lumping quantity and quality as a number structure of one. And so he's saying that Hegel is avoiding the error of the void. He's stitching it up together as avoiding the error of the void, where Badiou argues that actually Hegel stitching this up is actually proof of the void, that it exists, and so on. But yeah, okay, I'll leave it there.
No, that's all wonderful. I like I said, I appreciate it. So there's a few things. First off, one of the great problems with Hegel is that Hegel writes a whole lot to show that an idea fails. And we're very used to only someone writing something if that's what they're defending. So a lot of times in Hegel's philosophy, it is a movement of the understanding precisely to show that if understanding follows this logic, as it necessarily must, because here's the thing, like if you read on the page, oh, understanding eventually fails, for Hegel, that's not going to be enough. You have to experience the failure. So it's more like a proof of a phenomenological journey. That's the phrase Cadell uses, right? And so you have to watch understanding reach the failure. And then at that point of failure, he goes, okay, understanding will necessarily fail here. What does that mean? How do we then logic based on that failure? But you see, you have so many interpretations of Hegel all over the place because people are reading the process to describe the failure as what Hegel is saying is the case, when he's in fact showing the failure is the case. And that's why you get such an explosion of different interpretations and different things, right? But for him, he has his whole philosophy is based on the movement of thoughts. And so he has to show the movement because that changes the thought. Thought that is aware of how thinking works is different from thinking that doesn't know how it works. That's the move. And so then he has to describe to you how thinking works. Once you understand how thinking works, then you realize the thought you had to realize that that's how thinking works no longer applies, because upon finishing this chapter, the character of thought changes because now you know how it works. Chapter 2 will be based on the movement of that new thought that now understand how it works until you get to the end of the next layer, next layer, next layer, next layer, and different things, right? So this is why it's so tricky. Badiou, on the point that he's making on Hegel, I think it's very important that Hegel's good infinity, it's the difference between true infinity and spurious infinity. Hegel is suggesting that all infinities of the list are spurious. He wants to say they are not true because you cannot find a spurious infinity in reality. He goes on and on against the notion of infinity in the science of logic. He says, just because all these mathematicians, they assume infinity exists because when they plug it into their formula, they get a result they know is true. He says that doesn't follow. Just because you get a result you know is true does not mean the variables that got you to that result are therefore real. That's what he's very critical of. Like I can reach a result where I talk about a great political conspiracy and my conclusion is you can't trust politicians. Well, it could be absolutely true you shouldn't trust politicians, but that doesn't mean Pizzagate is true, right? Even though I use Pizzagate as evidence that you shouldn't trust politicians, right? My conclusion is true, but the variables that got me to that conclusion are not necessarily true. So he's critical of the notion of infinity. For him, a true infinity is a geometrical situation, like a circle. A circle has infinite points of relation within itself. That's the only true infinity, is the infinity between finite variables. Like between 1 and 2, there is in fact an infinite number of ways that 1 can become 2, but there is not an infinite set beyond of finite numbers. You have no infinity like 2, only infinity of. And so I think Badiou's understanding of Hegel, I don't think Badiou is correct in his reading of Hegel's infinity, because Hegel's infinity is phenomenological, and Badiou is very much, as a mathematical Platonist, very much not on the side of phenomenology. The idea of a phenomenological infinity is absurd to him. But we said at the beginning that Hegel's philosophy is grounded precisely by the fact that phenomenological experiences of a tree are just as real as the idea of a tree. The idea of a tree is made full by the phenomenological experience of a tree, and both are equally in your head and they are both equally in the world. So the infinity, so another way to look at this, Hegel would say there's an infinite number of ways that you can relate to a tree. Because the moment you say that's a tree, you can say, I'm now thinking about the tree. I'm now thinking about the tree geometrically. I'm now thinking about the tree in relation to other people. There is an infinite configuration of relations to the phenomenon of a tree, but the tree and you are finite entities. That's a true infinity. And this is the Hegelian move. Wait a minute. Idea, notion, develops according to a true infinity, not a spurious infinity. Because for most of history, what he said is we've had ideas trying to find a spurious infinity. 1 more piece of knowledge, 2 pieces of knowledge, 3 pieces of knowledge, more and more research, then we'll reach the truth. And he's like, look, I have no problem with incredibly large finite numbers. You know, if you want to talk about 20 trillion pieces of knowledge, that's perfectly fine. But the moment you start talking about infinite finite expression, that's a problem. There, finite and enormous are not similes, right? So he has nothing against the notion of adding finite knowledge on and on to gather more finite knowledge. The problem is the move of saying finite knowledge is infinite versus enormous. What he wants to say is if you're meaningfully talking about the infinite, you must be talking about a change in the quality of a relation between 2 finite entities. And that is theoretically infinite because the idea can always change. There is no limit to what you can dream, right? Now, Hegel would also make the point that you just happen to always dream in colors. You just happen to always dream in shape. So the infinite is not separable from the finite, right? That's why he's very much against this notion of an infinity that is transcendent. There's kind of 2 bad infinities in a way that he links together. There's a utterly transcendent infinity, capital I, that has nothing to do with the concrete, the finite. But then there is the infinite of the spurious list. Okay, both of those he's kind of against. He's like, that's a problem. But the infinity of the endless relation to the finitude that changes the quality of the finitude. So you take a horse, you take a rhinoceros, and you put them together and you get a unicorn. There's a new quality of experience, but it actually is not, the imagination is always based in the real. You can't separate them. Horses are real, horns are real, you put them together. You imagine a spaceship is made of metal, outer space is real, you put them together, right? So it's not that when imagination, which is the realm of the idea, is not limited, but the way that it is not limited has the character of finitude. You see? So quality is always infinitely new, possibly. There is no theoretical limit to imagination. There is no theoretical limit to imagination, but it is not spurious because in the imagination is a relation to the finite, into finitude. It is not adding to an infinite list. It is a changing of a quality of a relation. So he says you can do that in dreams. You can do that in imagination. Well, that's what you do with the tree. That's what you do in a relationship. That's what you do with people. True infinity is, in fact, that unfolding of new qualities. This also suggests what God is for Hegel, because as you were making the point on, oh, you're just going to call it capital V void or whatever, right? Hegel would say that God is kind of the X variable, that all of history is a failure to say, and we require that failure so that when we finally say it right, we know we say it right and it's meaningful to us. In the same way that we have to go through a history of whole and parts using that language and it's a failure, so that when we get to the place where we talk about emergence, it's meaningful to us, but then that talk of emergence unveils and negates the entire history of the logic of whole and parts that you required, though, to understand emergence. Likewise, in Hegel, there's an idea that God is that word that you have to keep on missaying and missaying, so that when you can get to the place in history, when you say it meaningfully, it's actually meaningful to you. So then calling God void, God, God Yahweh, God Trinity, you're using all these different languages. And every religion knows you can't talk about God, and yet we must not talk about God, right? That's kind of the weird move. It's like we have to fail to talk about God, but that is meaningful. There is a meaning in that failure. Is the word void the best way to capture that? And this is the debate now. Because if you think about it, it becomes linguistical, right? And this is why the concept creates nature. Because if you say void is the best way, then the way notion develops in nature, the kind of churches you make, the kind of community you make, the kind of society you make will be different from a people that refers to God as Trinity, or God as cow, or God as nature. Whatever language you use, notion changes how you act in the world. Then how you act in the world changes your ideas, which change how you act in the world. And all of that is possible, though, because for Hegel, there actually is a God of whom lets you play. We were saying earlier, right, that you have these moments of a psychedelic or disclosure that say, no, there's a concrete reality here. And because there's a concrete reality, then when we try to speak of God and fail, it's a meaningful effort because there is something there we're failing to reach. But for Hegel, that God lets you fail. He creates the space where you can fail because that God knows that the process of failing is necessary so that when you reach God, it is meaningful to you. In the same way that you necessarily fail with the language of whole and part, so that when you arrive at the language of emergence, it's meaningful to you. And then one day that will be a failed language. And one day that will be a failed language, on and on and on and on. That's true infinity. That is the true infinity of history relating to its language and its concepts by new qualities that then changes how it unfolds through history, that changes how it unfolds through history on and on and on and on. Now that's Hegel's God, and you can take parts of that and add it to your own unique tradition or remove from it and so on and so forth. But to him, and that's also very inspired by Hermetic thinking. Hermetica, he's definitely very interested in the overlays between Egyptian and Greek thought, and that's an entirely another ballgame that I will not get into in these last 4 minutes before I have to run. The reason this is also very interesting to me, the other thing I've been thinking a lot about with Hegel, because metaphors matter, we talk a lot about the gap, right? The gap. There's a gap that can't be fulfilled. There's a very real sense in which understanding experiences incompleteness as a gap to get to the place where you realize it's not a gap, but an edge. Like, are there gaps in a novel when you read a book? In a sense, but it's also not a gap because you got to get to the last chapter. When you're at the beginning, there's a sense that there's a gap, but it also seems like the language of gap is inadequate. Really what it is that there's an edge that you have to push forward, and the gap is what is across the edge, but it's not really a gap, meaning there's another side. The problem with the language of gaps can be it suggests that you're on this side and there's another side you cannot cross, right? That's what gap can mean. I can't cross the gap, right? Now, I, of course, know we all know what we mean when we talk about gap and lack and incompleteness. But in a very funny way, in Hegel, understanding encounters the lap, ergo gap, to realize that actually there isn't another side to the gap. No. What I'm encountering as a gap is the edge of the universe, per se, that notion in nature is pushing forward according to its own conception and idea of that edge that then changes how the universe expands, per se, how the universe unfolds, how creation comes into being according to different qualities. And you see, the true infinity is the pushing of that edge. A spurious infinity is one that's crossing the edge. You're going across. The true infinity that says, no, we are relating to that edge by newer and newer ways and different qualities that then pushes that edge, which is to say that the story unfolds. And it unfolds differently. It's like a choose your own adventure story, right? Like, it's like you choose your own adventure, and based on what you choose, based on how you relate to the notion, changes how nature unfolds, which changes the notion, and thus the edge of the universe, the edge of the story changes. Since there is no theoretical limit to that edge, the word infinity is valid. And it is also a true infinity, because the edge is in fact experiential. You can experience the edge, well, you cannot experience a spurious infinity by definition because it's going on. For Hegel, the only way you can talk of a true infinity is an infinity that finitude can relate to. And this is a true infinity because it's an edge that you are pushing infinitely. So you are relating to it. You are thinking it, so you are pushing the edge forward infinitely, of which then changes your quality as you push it, because you get stronger, you get more imagination, you get more ideas, that changes how you push this. And so the true infinity is in fact true. And it also changes the constitution of what you believe is true, because the logic changes what is true and the true changes the logic, as we were saying at the beginning. So it is the only true infinity, and it just turns out to be the case that that infinity that finitude relates to is precisely the source of the quality of finitude itself. It is what makes finitude possible. And without finitude, you would not have a thing that could fail to be fully infinite and thus be more meaningful in that failure by existing and failing than if it never was at all. Just like language that fails to speak is better than silence, because a language that fails to speak is different in quality than never saying anything at all. Likewise, finitude that fails to be infinite because it is the relating to the possibility of itself by infinite quality and thus never completes itself, that kind of finitude is different in quality and unfolding than a finitude that is only finitude one-sided, separated from infinity, or an infinity that is separated from finite as one-sided. And so a finitude changes in quality because it relates to a true infinity that changes its quality, and then a finitude that realizes that this is its character, just like thought that realizes how thought works is different in quality. And then a finite that comes to own its participation in the true infinity will carry its relation to that true infinity differently. And what Hegel wants to ask us is, how might the universe unfold differently if the universe was aware of the fact that how it unfolds is relative to how it thinks and relates to its very unfolding? What might be possible? Perhaps we'll belong in a way that is not reductionist.
Dang, Daniel, I think you just gave us like the whole breakdown of Hegel.
No.
No, for real, that was good stuff. Actually, I have no problem actually. I think I'm more like thinking, and we can leave this for later as an ending. I'm just more thinking about the discrepancy between these two modes of thought. What Hegel presents as phenomenology and what Badiou presents as the matheme. I wonder how can we connect the two without succumbing them both to the conditions that they erupt from. So, for example, what I mean is thinking Hegel and Badiou without succumbing them to both what they advocate for, phenomenology and the matheme.
Yeah, it's the not to interrupt you, but it's the massive question. Heidegger, so Hegel starts with being. How is he justified to start with being? Okay. Badiou is going to start with kind of a notion of Platonic mathematics. How is he justified? How are you justified to start in X place without assuming X place? It's actually the massive philosophical quandary, okay? Hegel does it by saying that if you follow his logic, you arrive at the end at where he started, which gives you reason to think that that start is actually there. Oh, and it's based on immediacy itself. He would say to someone like Badiou, he said, oh, you're saying that Platonic mathematics is kind of ultimate reality, right? Now, I know that's vague and so on and so forth. He's like, where do you see that? Where do you see it? Where do you see the number 2? Where do you see Platonic mathematics? Where, he says, to have that assumption, you have to think that assumption. And you have to think in a way that separates thought from phenomenon. You never observe in phenomenon thought separated from phenomenon. So Hegel would be like, my starting place, there is more reason to think that my starting place is valid versus yours, because you have to start with a thought that separates thought from phenomenon. My thought starts with immediacy. And it is based on the immediacy that immediacy is only immediate because of thought. And it is the following of thought in the immediacy versus over the immediacy. And then Hegel would be like, okay, so that's the difference. Show me in reality where there is reason to think that thought and phenomenon are separate. show me mathematics as separate from thought. Show it to me. And Badiou would say, but it's the same debate as everyone. They say, oh, it's probably discovered because look, it works so effectively, right? It's like, it can't be created because it's so accurate. Hegel would be like, you are assuming the existence of the variables from the accuracy of the result. No different than saying the government is corrupt because of Pizzagate. The government could be corrupt and there'd be no Pizzagate. You cannot assume the validity of the variables based on the result, because it simply could be that the variables exist as they do because of the result. It works backwards, but then as it's presented, it seems like it's forward, right? And Hegel would be like, prove to me, Badiou, that that's not what you're doing. How do you know that? But Badiou would just have to assert that he's not doing it, but he could not show you in immediacy that that's not what he's doing. So Badiou has to make a thought. The moment you say math is discovered and not created, you've taken a thought and put it in immediacy, as opposed to have thought come from immediacy. And that's how he would say. So he would say Badiou's starting point is not justified. Also, Badiou does not at the end arrive you back into immediacy in a manner that you see immediacy as disclosing mathematic Platonism. You will never have immediacy disclosed to you mathematical Platonism unless you think mathematical Platonism. Whereas in Hegel, you arrive at immediacy and all you do is watch the phenomenon. That's why he says, look up. He's like, look, the thing right there is presenting itself as a tree. And yet the concept of tree, where is it? It's there. The concept is there. And therefore the concept is indivisible from the phenomenon. You can't have mathematical Platonism because that requires a split between the phenomenon and the concept. And be like, where is that? Where? Show it to me. Show it to me. And you'd be like, well, I can think the number 2 and it's not reality. And you'd be like, that's because that's an abstraction. That's a mistake. The moment you think a thought that cannot be found in reality, you're making a mistake, the spurious mistake. Of course you can err. The reason you are able to make that mistake is because if you couldn't err, if you couldn't make mistakes, you couldn't do the thing of talking about wholes and parts to arrive at the place of emergence where it's different in quality to negate all of history. So what he's saying is you are mistaking the possibility of thought that is error as thought that is unveiling truth. That's what you're doing, which of course you can do because you're capable of mistake. You are capable of mistaking thought that is leading to mistake as leading to truth, which in of itself is a giant mistake, because thought must be capable of mistake to advance through history to a place where it thinks wholes and parts are real, so that when it gets to the place of emergence, that's meaningful to it. That mechanism of the possibility of mistake is necessary for the development of thought. And what is happening is because of a presupposition of thought being more real than phenomenon, or that the structures of phenomenon being found mathematically would therefore mean the structure is more real than the thing. You are taking that and saying that that is the truth. And Hegel would say, okay, maybe it is. Just show me where you see it. Show me where you see it. Find it for me. Or if you cannot find it, there would be strong reason to think that it is simply an abstraction. It is, and for Hegel, any abstraction that cannot work itself into the concrete and therefore be negated as just an abstraction is that which there would be far less reason to believe is probably the case than is the case. You can never have certainty, but of course you can't, because if you could have certainty, you could avoid error, and error is the necessary condition for the possibility of the advancement of thoughts. So you can't have, the very inability to have certainty is why history can advance. And so the problem also with mathematical Platonism is it is suggesting the possibility of certainty, which would be the death of history for Hegel, is the high point of history. And in fact, Hegel would be like, let's look back on history. Let's see what is the case. Was there ever a period in history where certainty would have helped with advancement? No. If you look back, it's all mistakes, 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 building upon mistakes. Actually, the civilizations that are screwed are the ones that are certain of themselves, isolationist, shut themselves off, cut down the conversation, and the religions, theologies, philosophies, and societies that have survived and thrived have been ones of constant dialogue, free exchange, theological debate, the live activity of the back and forth. No certainty is where you see the concept developing. So then Hegel would turn around and be like, so why would you think certainty would be the ticket now? Why would you think that now things are different, right? Maybe that's hubris. Maybe that's the hubris of progress, where you think that this moment in history is the one that you need to extend on into the future forever. And therefore we should get certainty so we can extend it on into forever. There's no such thing as a spurious infinity, though. And an extension of the present moment forever into the future would be a spurious infinity. And last time I looked, that would be death, because a concept that is purely abstract and can't become and change is dead. And so certainty would be death. And the reason we fall into the mistake, though, of certainty is because we want to avoid error. But the moment you avoid the possibility of error, you are stuck with a concept of wholes and parts that is wrong, but you never can know you're wrong. And therefore, you're the Kierkegaardian man in despair who doesn't know they're in despair. So it is better to be possible of mistake so that you can know that you're in mistake, as opposed to never know you're in mistake because you're so certain that you're right. Fold chairs now, and I've really enjoyed this. So this has been great. Glad we could talk about it. Hi, Ruth. You're great. Javier, you're great. Glad we could talk about reality and stuff. It was grand. Really enjoyed it. So thank you, guys. You're great.
Yeah, take care.